Hey everybody, welcome back to Monday, the best night of the week. You know what that means? It's time for this week's episode of RfRx, your prescription for coping. I'm Kara, I'll be your host this evening, or whatever time of day it is for you, and I have with me returning co-host and potential trouble source, Helen. Helen, how are you doing?
Good, my friend Cara. How are you?
I am well. I am super excited about having just gotten back from the American Atheist Convention, which was this past weekend,
I am
which,
very jealous.
yes, it was super fun. We missed you.
I
It
know,
was
I
a
miss
lot
some of
of
my
fun, though.
friends.
Yeah. Hopefully you'll come next time. It was great. We had a table for RFR in the hallway at the convention, and we got to meet a lot of cool people and hear a lot of amazing presentations and talks.
That's
So it was
awesome.
great. Yeah. Well, what have you been up to, Helen? Did you do anything fun and exciting this weekend?
Um, I got my nails done. I I didn't do a lot. I got my nails done. I cleaned around my house, and yesterday, since it was Easter, I decided to instead celebrate Trans Visibility Day by being a gender. So that was
Yes.
it's a much better holiday than Easter in my opinion. So
Yes, I agree.
yeah,
Yes, and happy Trans Day of Visibility, a day late to
yeah.
everyone as well. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And can we see your nails?
Oh yeah. So if anyone, and for those of you, my nail tech also hand painted some art on my nails. So it's a very
Awesome.
springtime. I wanted springtime nails. So
Yes.
because
Well, those look great.
I guess I can celebrate spring, but screw Easter.
Exactly. Yes, I'm also celebrating spring with the cherry blossom photos
I
behind
love them.
me.
They're so pretty.
Yes, I got to see those in person and they were beautiful. So yay for spring or almost spring. I guess it's almost spring, but I don't, is it?
No, it's past
I
spring.
don't
It
know.
was the equinox was on the
It is
20th.
spring.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Yes. Well, welcome to spring. Okay. Yes, I'm really up to date. I know what month we're in.
We're in
Yeah.
April. It's April Fool's Day.
Aha, that was the joke. I pretended like I didn't
Yeah.
know what month it was. See, I gotcha. That was
Aha,
funny.
aha.
Haha.
Sorry, Bob's go.
Yes. What is our topic today? Let me tell you. Today, we are going to hear about black and white thinking in a gray world from Dr. Ben. And our description is, as I said, Dr. Ben is back by popular demand to expand on his discussion of the intersections of healthcare, bias, and belief. Dr. Ben will discuss the real-world consequences of cognitive bias and examine common lines of reasoning which contribute to healthcare disparities. And the presentation will be followed by Q&A. So, Helen, would you like to introduce Dr. Ben?
Yes, I would. So, Dr. Ben is a trailblazing resident physician on a mission to bridge the gap between the medical world and the public. Dr. Ben brings a unique perspective to the field as a trans man, weaving personal experiences and professional expertise to communicate current issues in medicine with authenticity and empathy. As a proud member of the LGBTQ plus community, Dr. Ben understands the importance of representation in healthcare. He's breaking down barriers and fostering understanding by sharing his journey as a trans man in the medical field. Dr. Ben is not just a doctor, he's a voice for inclusivity, diversity, and compassionate care. Dr. Ben is a regular contributor to the conversation on online programs such as the Transatlantic Call-In Show, Talk Heathen, in his own channel, Family Dr. Ben, where he addresses medicine, skepticism, and LGBTQ plus rights. So thank you for coming back, Dr. Ben. I'm so glad you're here, honey. Thank you for joining us again.
I'm happy to be back. And for people who missed the last conversation, I definitely think it'd be a good one to watch after this, because it gives more of an overview of kind of what we're talking about today. Although today it can be a standalone talk, because last time we talked a lot about abortion, we talked a lot about trans rights, we talked a lot about different communities and how they're impacted by essentially people making decisions that they have no right to be making. And so today we're going to go more into detail about the thought process that allows people to think that they should be making decisions that they should not be making. And I'm going to be framing this from a medical perspective just because that's my experience and something I can talk to. But this topic extends into pretty much every area of expertise out there. I'm guilty of a lot of these things with regards to finance. I do not know anything about money. And if I ever start talking about things in the economy, I should not be, because I do not know what I'm talking about. And a lot of the issues that I've seen, especially on call-in shows or other places, is that you get a lot of people going back to common sense, or they go back to whatever intuition they're thinking of and using that to rationalize certain decisions or certain thought processes when they don't have really a foundation at all to be talking about it. And so that's kind of where we're going into with this, is the topic, black and white reasoning in a gray world, because a lot of times we boil down these arguments to like a black and white issue of like, it's always this, it's always that. But putting it into context, there pretty much everything is a multivariate system. And the more you learn, the more you understand, I didn't think about this contributor, or I didn't think about this one. And so we're going to kind of explore cognitive bias. And I know Richard Gilliver did an amazing talk here about cognitive bias not too long ago. But we're going to kind of take the overarching topic and then kind of gear towards practical application and understanding how these happen, and then how this impacts people, and then kind of how we move on from there and how do we correct these things. So our objectives for this talk are just kind of going through the general. We're going to do some scenario-based learning. We're going to talk about some terminology, and then we're going to get into some psychology, which I know we have a lot of people here who love psychology, but it's very important to understand this in all areas. And I think it's a good topic to touch on anyway. So we're going to talk about the dual processing model and how it impacts decision making. And then we're going to go into discussing some common cognitive biases and then ways that we can mitigate those. And then finally, we're going to kind of wrap that up into what does all of this mean for healthcare outcomes, and why should we even care about this? So going in, first of all, we've got this picture here, and this is a video. We'll see if it works for you all, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen this particular video. So this is a 2D image that appears to be rotating. And as it says here, you'll notice that the dancer is rotating one way or another. And you can, depending on how easy it is for you to readjust your brain, you can see it spinning in the other direction. And how this works is pretty fascinating. It's not a left brain versus right brain thing. Like, that's kind of outdated ways of thinking about this. But the fact is, here we have a 2D image. And this illusion breaks down if you add 3 dimensions to it, because you have symmetry here. And this particular example is even nicer than some people have taken this silhouette and made it completely symmetrical, which really messes with your brain. Because essentially here with this one, you can clearly see what part of the person is the front of the body and what part is the back of the body. We know it with enough detail to differentiate between those two. But the left and right sides are both completely symmetrical. And so you can change the way you're seeing the rotation, because your brain cannot understand which side is left and which side is right. And so you can't tell which way is it going away from you or towards you. And so if you take something like this and make it completely symmetrical for front and back and side to side, it can really mess with you, because you have nothing to guide your brain into saying which way it's rotating. For example, if you had like, even with this one, if you had certain markings on the fingers, if you had certain markings like on the feet, like if you could know which side is left and right, that would tell you a lot more about how you should be interpreting this image. And so getting into this next scenario, we're going to start off with something a bit easier. And then as we go, we're going to slowly, or kind of rapidly in this case, lose our anchors to what is telling us more information. So here I have 2 x-rays. These are 2 separate kids on the left and right. So on the left side, we're going to call this child A, and on the right, we're going to call this child B. So it's pretty easy, even for a non-medical professional, to kind of understand what's going on here. And if you want to weigh in the side chat, if anyone wants to tell me what you think is going on here with these images.
I'm guessing they've swallowed something.
Yeah. So there's something
Yeah.
that a child put in their mouth, and now we see it on the X-ray.
Mm.
So there are two kids here, and one of these kids is having much more of an emergency than the other one. But these images are very similar, and let's don't even factor in the size of the object, or the age of the child, or the size of the child. Don't factor in any of that. Just based on these images, if we assumed that both of these were very similar in those aspects, what could we think about that might make one child more of an emergency than the other one? If anyone has any thoughts.
I'm just gonna, for child A, it's right at the base of their throat, and that I'd be worried more about them might be restricting the airway more than child B. I just from 2-second observation.
Yeah, so it's definitely position, but you cannot tell based on this image, which is where we get into fun things. So we have one image. This is not enough information at all to figure it out. So I'm gonna add another image for both of these, and this might clarify things a little bit more. So we have a second image for both of them added on. And so now we have the front and back view, and now we also have a side-to-side view. So this can more accurately tell us what's happening. So which child is having more of an emergency in this case, do you think?
I'm thinking that I'm really glad I'm not a medical doctor.
Me too.
I'm gonna be honest, I don't know.
So it is, you all think that B is having more of an emergency?
I was gonna say
consensus
B.
I'm seeing.
I was gonna say B, but then I was like, well, this is why you don't want to give me any medical stuff, because I'll just be sitting going like, I think it's B.
So the more emergent one in this case is A, the one on the left. And there's a specific reason. And yes, you should take both of these children to the doctor, but specifically with the position, we see that it's in the neck somewhere, but in child A, we see it's much more anterior. So it's more to the front, which is much more concerning that this is a tracheal foreign body. And on the right side, child B is more posterior, consistent with an esophageal foreign body. So one kid inhaled the item, and this is a coin specifically. One child inhaled a coin, and one child swallowed a coin. And neither situation is great, but one of them is much more of an emergency that I need to act on right now than the other one. So that's an example of where having extra information was very important. But let's say you have a similar situation where, let's say you have a child coming in that is having some trouble, breathing, maybe trouble swallowing. They're not super specific about what their symptoms are because it's a 2-year-old, so they're not really able to tell you what's going on, but something's not right. So you think maybe this is a foreign body. We should investigate. So you get an X-ray, and this is your image now. So
and for
did this
people
child...
who are listening, I was just going to describe it for anybody who's listening and not seeing, we're not seeing a foreign body in this X-ray, right?
Nope.
Okay.
So the previous pictures were pretty obvious. You saw something that was abnormal, and I think any of us in this room could make that determination. But for this next one, did this child inhale a foreign body?
I have no idea.
Yeah, and Will's got it right. So we can't say for sure that there was or wasn't a foreign body, but in a child of this age, it's a very likely possibility because we do see a pneumothorax on the right lung over here. So that's something that once we've lost our easy clue of a radio opaque foreign body, now we have to go to something else. Like our pattern that we wanted to recognize and wanted to see is not available. So when our immediate clue isn't there, what do we do? How do we solve this problem? Something needs to happen. And in this case, the lungs gave us another clue that said, okay, we have at least some reasonable suspicion that this was the case, but also because we don't have that easy evidence, we also have the issue of more broad differentials as well, because we have a collapsed lung in this child, but what caused that? It's very likely a foreign body, but what if it isn't? But the other thing too, the fact is not all foreign bodies are easy to see on X-ray. And so if that's the case, how do we solve for it? But in taking this example further, let's say we don't even have this clue. So we have suspicion of a foreign body. We don't have a radio opaque object, and we don't have evidence of a pneumothorax. So how do we then how do we make a decision if we don't have any of those clues? What's another step we can take?
Oh, as a social scientist, I'm gonna suggest that we ask them.
They're 2 years old. They will not tell
Oh,
you.
blast!
I'm
Exhausted my
hoping I would
resources.
ask a parent or guardian that brought them into the ER of what
They
happened.
didn't. The parent didn't see anything happen. They left the child alone for 5 minutes, and now their child's in distress, and they don't know why. Which this is real stuff that happens. Like you get absolutely no information.
I would,
But I have
like when she was, because if the child was having trouble breathing, you know, had maybe like discoloration or something, you know, that you could like identify as an actual like, you know, distress.
So here's the kind of the next picture, and this is probably what the next step would be. So if we weren't able to see anything on the initial X-ray, now we have 2 X-rays of the same person. So one of them is an inspiration and one of them is an expiration. Do you think this person has a foreign body? At least in their airway, I should say.
I feel like we're supposed to be able to tell from these images, but I cannot.
Yeah, and we're losing more and more clues. And so in this one, yeah, so this person does, because if we have the lungs in inspiration, you should be increasing your lung volume on inspiration. You should be decreasing your lung volume on expiration. And we see the left lung over here has decreased in size, but the right one has not. So there's something blocking airflow. Something is not allowing air to leave. And so this person would likely become the pneumothorax in the one above, but we're not there yet. So luckily, this kid was able to have it caught before it happened. So this was all a very, like, kind of initially pretty simple case that kind of led to some more complex thought processes. And that's exactly what I wanted to do with this, because it's very easy to look at a situation when there are easy patterns and easy clues and say, I can solve that easy pattern. I can do these other things too. And that's something that you see oftentimes with like chiropractors, naturopaths, like a lot of those people that claim to be medical professionals, or even people without qualifications to be doing this type of work that have enough exposure to be dangerous in a way to where they know enough to say, I can recognize the easy patterns, but then they're not at a place where they can handle some of these situations where they don't have the clues. And we're all like that in certain areas of jobs and certain areas of expertise that we're not as familiar with. And so we have to be very cautious about equating our experience and our common sense, if you will, to some more nuanced situations that we might not be equipped to answer. So some takeaways from this specific scenario is that common sense is really unreliable, because my common sense for some of those last few pictures are that, hey, I don't see anything there. They don't have a foreign body. They're not in distress from this. It's got to be something else. Well, but that's not always true. What are we missing here? And that's something we always have to ask, is what are we missing? Is my intuition correct? Or am I just using my intuition to ask a question? And that's usually where I take this conversation. Is I think common sense is okay to spark further investigation, but it's not enough by itself to make decisions or to say I'm done investigating because I've heard this before. Kind of the second takeaway is that kind of in addition to that, patterns and context clues may be unavailable or unreliable. So there's even with this above scenario, there's an easy clue that a lot of people in healthcare have learned with the position of the coin with ingestion versus aspiration. Oftentimes, if you can see the full round coin from a frontal view of the X-ray, that's oftentimes seen as that's esophageal, and if it's the other way, it's tracheal, and that's a common pattern that we're just taught to assume. But that can be wrong, as those pictures I took from actual cases, which I have cited in my references, like those are actual cases where the pattern breaks down and it no longer works. So we can't always rely on that, or they just might not be available. So if we don't have the answers or we don't have something easy, where do we go? How do we think about this? So it's reasonable to walk away with this and think, can I trust my brain at all then? And I think that's too much of an extreme to say you can't ever trust your brain, but it definitely makes you wonder, should I be investigating more? How do I think about this? How do I, in conjunction, use logic and take into account that there is subject matter that needs to be understood and experience that needs to be had before some of these more in-depth decisions can be made. And unfortunately, a lot of people in our government don't understand this point as they continue to make medical decisions for other people, and especially obstetric decisions, which are very, very dangerous, as we talked about last time. So kind of going forward into some terminology, which if any of you have taken a pretty like easy, like basic general psychology class, you'll probably have run into these terms before. And so we're going to be talking about heuristics. So a heuristic, I am going to differentiate between heuristic and bias because they're a little bit different, at least in the terms that we're using them today. So a heuristic is the mental shortcut that's commonly used to simplify problems and avoid cognitive overload. So like I often say heuristics are like cognitive laziness in a way. So like it's to prevent your brain from getting overloaded in the process of learning and processing information. So this is specifically how you intake information. And slightly in contrast to cognitive bias, which are predispositions to favor a given conclusion over other conclusions, often used to influence decision making. So cognitive bias is kind of how we like utilize our heuristic to then approach real life and how we move forward with those heuristics that we've already established. And this is all in contrast to logical fallacies, which we talk about pretty frequently in this community, which is the reasoning used in the construction of an argument used to justify said decisions. So it's important that, you know, we understand logical fallacies, but I think too often we focus on fallacies and not enough on how are we intaking this information? How did I learn this? And then how am I using that information? And why do I think this heuristic is appropriate to generalize and apply to decisions that they may not be appropriate for?
Oh, I have a
So
question.
go for it.
Um,
Yeah.
it sounded to me like you were suggesting at the end there that something that we commonly might find ourselves doing or not realize we're doing is
Mhm.
thinking that we have used logic to arrive at a conclusion when in fact we used some sort of heuristic or a cognitive bias took place, and then
Mhm.
after the fact we try to reason it away saying it was a logical decision, but it may be faulty logic. Is that what you were suggesting?
Yes, absolutely. And that's something too,
Okay.
like something that I encounter frequently is that you can have a completely logical argument without fallacies, but it can still be incorrect. And so it's okay to focus on like how am I arguing this? But at the end of the day, it has to be sound and how you got there and your interpretation of the world needs to be accurate because like you can justify some pretty terrible things for very logical reasons, but not with anything that applies to reality, especially applies to a reality of humans. And And so it's important that we kind of address all of these facets. So going into the dual processing model of thinking, which I absolutely love this model. And of course, there's some, like, it is a model, so it's not perfect, but it's very useful for kind of investigating how we think about problems and where we can improve on certain areas. And there are times and places for both of these. Like, this is not saying that either one of these processes is wrong. There's a time to use them. And there are downsides to each of them as well. So the dual processing model involves two processes, and some sources will call them system 1 and system 2. Others will say type 1 and type 2. Those are the same thing. But type 1 is our intuition and forward reasoning, as they say here. So this is kind of our autopilot, or our algorithm, if you will. So this is kind of what we often lean towards. So it relies on heuristics and pattern recognition. And often, like, our common sense comes from this. Like, my common sense can tell me, like, if I walk outside, like, I don't know, the sky is not something that can actually fall on me. Like, I know that. You'd have to really, if you wanted to prove that, you'd have to do a lot more work to do that. But we can make that assumption pretty easily. Some other things are, if, you know, reasonably, if I walk out to my car, I know that the handle on my car door has been there. It would be pretty reasonable for me to make the assumption that it's still going to be there, even though I haven't demonstrated with a logical proof that that door handle is going to be there. Like, there are certain things that we can intuit and can rely on, not thinking in depth about every single time we do it. So this is essentially that. It's very fast, it's unconscious and intuitive. It relies on memories that you have, and it relies on experiences. And it's very context dependent. So I know how things have been, the way that I've done them, the way that I've seen them, but I don't necessarily know how that's going to work in a different context. Like, I might be very confident about something in my home country, but going into a different country, I might not be as confident that, like, if I were to go into a store and to ask somebody for, like, the price of something, I can reliably, like, intuit what my interaction is going to be like here in the US, but I can't necessarily rely on that in another part of the world. And so I might not be able to use this type of reasoning as well for that, because of the context. This is really nice because it's fast, it's super efficient, and it's oftentimes what we use in emergency. So emergency medicine highly relies on this because it's fast. Like, if you have somebody that's dying, you don't have time to sit back and think through all the history of medicine and what specific like systemic problem is contributing to their presentation. Like, there's a point later on where you can do that, but in the moment, I just need to stabilize and move. I just need to figure out what is the next step immediately. And this is where type 1 thinking is very, very helpful. The problem is it's very heavily susceptible to bias, because you're just relying on your autopilot and your algorithm. So if you're, and we'll go through the biases as well, but these will heavily contribute to this, as well as emotions. You are much more likely to act with response to your emotions with kind of this very fast unconscious thinking than you would be if you take a step back. Like, for example, if you're angry at somebody, like, if you had a bad interaction, like with somebody on the road, even somebody cut you off for whatever reason, it's very easy to just assume, like, this person's being an asshole, they shouldn't do that, they should know better. But then maybe later on in the day, you think about it a bit and you're like, oh, maybe that person had a bad day. Maybe that person was going through something. Maybe I can't judge them as heavily because I don't know what's going on in their life. And that's kind of a difference right there between type 1 and type 2 thinking. So going into type 2 now, we have like, it relies less heavily on heuristics and patterns, and it's a very, like, intense cognitive process. So it's much more slow, it's analytical, it allows for more abstract thinking, some flexibility in how you engage with the problem. Because essentially this is like your ability to kind of sit at your desk and think, what are all the things contributing to this problem? Like, you're actually able to think about, okay, I'm trying to get from step A to step C, and let's think about B, or let's think about, are there other ways to get to C besides going through B? So it ends up being a lot more in depth, provides a lot more understanding usually, allows you to think about options that you didn't normally think of, allows you to take the time to even investigate further and consult other people if they're around. But some problems with that is that it's very, very exhausting. You can't always spend time contemplating why the sky is blue. I love to be able to do that with everything in my life, but I unfortunately don't have time often, or like, even if I have time, I might not have the emotional energy to go to the store and think about, how is this can of beans impacting people in Brazil? Like, it might have a significant impact on them, but I don't have the infinite like emotional and mental capacity to investigate things in my life that in depth. So it's very exhausting. It's very education dependent. So if you don't understand the problem, it's very hard to engage in this type of thinking. Like, if I don't understand the economy of Brazil and I don't understand the work that goes into producing this can of beans, or like the land mass it requires, like the energy it consumes, like there's a lot of variables that go into that I don't know enough about. And quite frankly, I can't make that decision about what the most ethical brand of beans is to buy based on all of that, because I don't have the necessary education to even begin engaging with that topic. So those are some downfalls, despite the fact that it's probably going to give you the most reliable data, assuming you have the background to get that data at all. So kind of seeing this process in action, this is a very kind of messy progress of what it looks like to use these patterns in a patient care setting, specifically the emergency room. So we have, because I think this comes from a study specifically investigating bias in emergency medicine. So we have a patient that comes to the emergency department, and you kind of have this part of your brain that senses a pattern, and you kind of instinctively go to, I recognize this pattern, I know what to do, or I don't recognize this pattern, I need to think a little bit more. And so you can pretty quickly make this determination. And so if you recognize the pattern, great, you go into type 1 processing, and then sometimes you can kind of integrate everything together along with type 2 processes and get to a diagnosis. Kind of looking on the other side of this, if you don't recognize the problem, you start going into type 2 processes, and then you can equate that, you can relate that to your type 1 process and figure out your next steps from there. But really what I wanted to use this image to show was where these two processes get in the way of each other, but also how they can help each other. So specifically, experts in a lot of fields will end up using type 1 processes for very complex scenarios. But it's not because they're being lazy necessarily. Sometimes it can be. But when you have enough experience with a particular problem and utilizing that type 2 process for that problem, it becomes autopilot, you get the repetition, and it becomes a pattern that you recognize. So this is where you have a very experienced expert, a very experienced physician in this case, that can handle, where you have a neurologist that can handle a stroke every day because it's a pattern they recognize now. You have cardiologists that can see people with heart attacks every day because that's a pattern they recognize now. And so they're less likely to engage in the biases that are going to confound that process. So they are able oftentimes to use type 1 pretty reliably, but that comes after years of experience and years of education to even get to that point. So this is kind of the executive override, essentially, where or your type 2, if you have like a bad type 1 process, your type 2 can step in and say, hold on, this isn't right, and can correct it. And that's with people who have enough knowledge to be able to correct their type 1 thinking. However, if you flip this around, let's say you have the chiropractor on YouTube, who there are plenty of them that you will see that will try to say that they can manage cancer. They'll say that they can manage pregnancy, which is like incredibly terrifying and terrible. But you have somebody who, let's say they recognize the pattern, but they don't actually. They recognize what they think the pattern is, but they really don't have the education or the experience to think about it beyond the minimum knowledge to be dangerous. So they engage with their type 1 process and they say, I've seen this before. My friend had a cold once. This is exactly what everybody is experiencing. You don't need to go to the emergency department for your, I don't know, pneumothorax because you were having difficulty breathing. I also had difficulty breathing when I had a cold. These are the same thing. I'll treat them the same way. So they engage in the type 1 process. They autopilot when they should not be. And they don't have the education needed to even begin a type 2 thought process. So they can't engage in the executive override. And anything that they would try to do with type 2, they just can't do it. So they're just stuck on this autopilot that's broken. And you can see where you get to a lot of severe problems. But something else, let's say you have somebody with enough experience and education, let's say a physician who has the education for type 2 thought process, but they have such heavy cognitive bias to where they say, like, I am feeling this way about this person, or I was taught this in med school back in the 1960s. Specifically, we'll get into this about race and gender, and all kinds of other topics where their bias will disrationally override their type 2 process, and where they should be able to think through the nuance, they essentially are unable to because they refuse to go down that route, or they just have so much bias that they're unaware of, like so much implicit bias that they can't overcome that hurdle, and therefore misdiagnose people and really hurt people. Like, medical misdiagnosis is incredibly prevalent, and a lot of it is because of implicit bias. And we'll get into specific scenarios that hopefully, like, thankfully now, a lot of people are working towards combating these biases, but they're still very, very heavily prevalent.
Do you think this is why there's been more of a push for people going into med school to have some psychology and sociology courses to
Yes,
try and build these skills?
absolutely. Absolutely it is.
Yay. Social sciences for the win.
Yeah, no,
Me.
and it's super, super important. Um, and I have a list here of some cognitive biases, and then I actually have a link here too of more cognitive biases than what could fit on this page. So I think I want to switch over to this.
And if we
And you all
could
can,
have that link, I would love to drop that in the chat as well.
yes. Yeah, can you all see this web page?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I just want to make sure. And I was like, do I have anything embarrassing on my other tabs? And I don't. So we're good.
I would call you.
Yeah, it's like,
We
it's
would
just
let you
the
know.
RfRx stuff at the top in the Zoom meeting. So like, we're all good here. But I am gonna drop this link. And this is part of another study. So I can also get you the link to the study. But this is particularly investigating cognitive biases in healthcare with specific examples of, like, medical examples of where these happen. And I know that Richard in his talk gave a good talk about framing bias, which I will talk a little bit about. But we'll touch on we'll kind of go through all these, but put some more depth in some bigger ones. So affective bias is actually really important, and why, like, giving healthcare advice to family and friends is a really bad idea. Because if you have somebody who you know very well, it can go in either direction. Like, either people can have like over treatment of things because they're like, this is my family member. I want the best from them. I'm going to fight for every possible test to be done on them. And I want every avenue to be explored. And that's one side that can cause people to have too much testing that can be risky. Or the opposite side is a lot of people don't want something bad to happen to their family member and are going to just assume that it's something less serious because it's their family member and they don't want to be the one giving that family member a bad diagnosis or having that conversation. So it's very important to recognize when you're not a good person for someone to talk to. And like that's the same thing, like we talk a lot about secular therapy. Like that's also a good reason why we need to have boundaries between like you and your friends and like mental health things. Like it's important that someone sees a professional that doesn't have that personal relationship with them so that they can be treated more objectively. So that's super, super important. As much as we want to be there for each other, sometimes the best thing you can do is to not be the one in the conversation, as hard as that is. And then a big one, like super, super big one, is anchoring bias. And that's something we see a lot, is people getting the initial information and running with that and essentially refusing to change their diagnosis or change their conclusion after getting new data because they're so focused on the initial thing that they were told. And this goes kind of hand in hand with some of these other ones where you are so dead set on your final diagnosis that even if something were to not fit the pattern, like we just write it off. That's like, oh, well, you're a person with chronic pain, and you're coming to my office with pain. So I'm just going to assume that this is your chronic pain and not something else because I am not thinking enough beyond what I initially thought you were presenting with. And this is often something we get with mental health too. It's like, I see that you have an anxiety disorder. You're here with anxiety that may or may not be related at all. Like a great example is in obstetrics where like, yeah, okay, people frequently have postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. But if somebody had a very traumatic delivery, like if they had an emergency C-section and a postpartum hemorrhage, or they had preeclampsia, anything else, like, okay, they could be anxious by being in the doctor's office, but maybe it's not because of their anxiety disorder. Maybe it's because they have legitimate trauma that needs to be addressed and they need to debrief and they need to build trust with a system that they feel harmed them. And so just writing that off as a mental health diagnosis is not always the right thing and could be evidence of anchoring bias in addition to some of these other biases. Same thing, premature closure is again kind of similar in that you've made a diagnosis, like you see someone's complaint of pain, they have chronic pain, and you know, I'm not even going to look at it because this fits my pattern I was expecting, so I'm just going to stop there. We don't need to do any more workup. Availability bias is another huge one, and something that I am guilty of a lot of the time, and I need to start kind of addressing more even on calls with people, because this is one where if an argument was presented recently, or like let's say you had a discussion like on anything, like if you take a religious discussion and you had an argument point that worked very well for this one person's argument, like using that out of context for this new person might not be the right move because their claim might not be the same. Like just approaching somebody's argument and thinking that this is exactly the same as the one this other person said might not be true. Or I had a patient yesterday who had presented, I don't know, with like anemia. I found out they were iron deficient. We gave them iron and they got better. Maybe I even had multiple people the other day with that. So if I had another person come in that had anemia, that was from something totally different, And if I just said, well, it's obviously this thing, that's a problem. I shouldn't look at somebody else's case based on what yesterday's person had, because probability doesn't work like that. And that also goes into the gambler's fallacy, kind of going down a bit later, of thinking that because, like, and this is a great one to talk about trans people too, where people think that something is so rare that if you've seen one person with that thing, the next person's not going to be that. So like if I am in a classroom and one of my classmates is trans, that doesn't mean, based on the odds, that everyone else is not going to be trans because there's a low probability of meeting a trans person out of the entire population of humanity. Like, no, you could still have an entire room of trans people. It's less likely based on the population, but you can't apply a global statistic and say that that's reflective of the group that you're in. And so that's the same thing with I see a lot with debates against intersex people, where they'll say, well, this is 0.07% of the population, therefore you're just not going to see this person. Like, but no, you could, and you need to treat everybody as their own probability based on all of the pretest probabilities and etc. You can't just say, I saw an intersex person in clinic yesterday, so that's the only one I'm ever going to see. Like, that would be doing people a disservice to not give them proper care based on the fact that you saw somebody else with that previously. And y'all can look into each of these in more detail as well. But overconfidence bias essentially is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And then confirmation bias is one we talk about a lot. But then, some other ones I do want to get into as well here. The action bias, the commission bias, omission bias, and then diagnostic momentum are all really great ones to touch on as well. So the action bias is where we assume that taking action is going to be more beneficial than not taking action, which actually I do see a lot of this being problematic in our community by very well-intentioned people. And specifically with regard to the LGBTQ community, because and with any minoritized community, I've seen this, but more recently, primarily with trans-related issues, in that people think that because it's a hot button topic and because somebody has the question, therefore they have to respond and they have to engage in that, even though they might not be the right one to engage with it. And in engaging, they might be causing more harm if they're spreading misinformation. So just like speaking about trans issues, just to speak about them and speak against transphobia is not necessarily better just because you're doing the action. It could be harmful, and you need to be very careful about, am I just thinking that the action is better, or am I actually having a positive impact? And then the same thing on the flip side, which I see less of in our community, is the fact that somebody isn't doing something and therefore, like, that's better or worse. You could kind of take this bias in either way. Like maybe being conservative on something is better by default than taking action because, oh, well, at least I didn't do something that was going to hurt them. At least I just held back. Well, but by not doing something, you could be hurting them. I think that one's a lot easier for us to understand in our community. And then diagnostic momentum is kind of a healthcare specific thing, but I think does apply outside of that, in that once you apply a label to something, that kind of snowballs and it carries through with somebody in other communities. So trying to think of like some good examples in atheism for this, but like if you label somebody as like, okay, they had this debate, it didn't go as well for them, they kind of made these points or whatever, and then saying that that's going to carry forward, we're going to treat that person like that's going to be the same case every single time and that was a correct assessment the first time. Like if somebody made I don't know, if they made an error in like a scientific argument, or they made an error in a biblical argument, that means this person is bad at Bible literacy, or they're bad at scientific literacy, and we take that forward and then we keep like engaging with them as if they're always going to have bad arguments in this area, is kind of disingenuous and problematic for somebody that maybe had a bad day and could potentially have other better arguments. So just a lot of things that we need to be kind of careful about.
So that would be kind of like persisting in a belief that came from your first impression, despite evidence to the contrary that comes up later.
Well, yeah, and also kind of in that, like passing it on to other team members, if you will, in this case of like if I had a debate with somebody and then Will had a debate with somebody, the same person, and carried forward some of these like negative attributions to this person based on the original encounter, like that can end up being fairly problematic. So I think there's a few different ways to apply these different things. And if other people have more examples too, I'd be curious to hear some of y'all's examples in the side chat.
I've got one.
Go for it.
I wonder if you could tell me which one of these this corresponds to. So I have a rare condition that is often misdiagnosed or undiagnosed that causes me to have really hypermobile joints and dislocate really easily and things like that. And a lot of people who have that condition describe themselves as zebras. And they have this kind of thing where they say, well, doctors are taught something along the lines of, if you hear hoofbeats, expect horses rather than zebras. But every once in a while, a zebra does come along that has the really unusual condition. So don't forget about those too. Would you say that corresponds to one of these types of biases?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, definitely. It corresponds to a few of them depending on how they use it. Because I've seen that particular situation in a sense of anchoring bias in my own like educational history. We're doing group case like studies or whatever, and which don't put like med students all in the same group to do diagnosis because everybody has opinions and it will not go well. But we had this case that was it was one of the zebras, and a lot of my like group members had anchored on a very common diagnosis, and they're like, oh, it's probably this because it's like the most common. But I spent 6 hours, I think, on that day because I saw something that did not fit the pattern. And I was like, I'm not content writing this off as just like a coincidence. Like, I want to be confident that this is not something concerning. And it turns out I was right. But like that whole time I had to fight with my team, and I'd say like, no, this does not line up. Why does this not line up? And it was something very like small and isolated, but it ended up being a teaching point in the lecture after that. And so it's like, I think that particularly was an example of anchoring. It's also premature closure. It's also likely availability in the case that they've likely seen the horse things before they've seen the zebra. And then you can easily, have some confirmation bias in there and saying, well, they have all these symptoms that align with this thing, which may or may not be specific to that. So I think that particular case is multiple biases at the same time, or at least could be.
Oh, that's an interesting point, though, too, that it's not even that you just have to identify, okay, which bias might be affecting me now. You can have influences coming in from multiple ones of these biases all at the same time.
Yeah, which makes it very, very complicating when you're trying to learn where you can do better, because our brains are great, but the fact that we're so good at pattern recognition and so good at like synthesizing information and making things make sense is also such a downside, because like it's so easy to fall into these traps because it's just too easy to not think about it.
I think also too that when we fall into a bias, and especially those of us that are skeptics and are always like, talking about reason and logic. And when I've talked to other people in this community as well, like when we're proven, if someone says, oh, you're wrong about this, and you think that you reasoned it through, and you're shown like a different sort of idea, that can sting a little bit more, because just because we are emotional creatures and emotions don't really care about what kind of logic you have, and it can cause people either to want to learn more and realize that they did something wrong, or they'll double down.
What's that, Helen? Feelings don't care about facts?
I know.
No,
Yeah,
it couldn't be.
I know. Shh.
Yeah, and some that weren't on the previous one, but the attribution bias here, like talking about stereotyping, which is super important, and then framing bias, which we'll touch on just briefly, but Richard also talked very well about that. So go watch his shameless plug for his talk, because he kind of really focused on that one in some depth. So, but a little bit on framing bias. There's just a nice little example of where this fits. Our brain definitely makes a shortcut with the first answer. You cover up the lower half of the letters, and it looks like it says health disparities, but you take that away, and it's actually this gibberish that now your brain can't do anything with because it doesn't make sense. So you might have thought you had an answer, but it's actually not at all the answer. And so this is kind of framing bias. And that also goes into the cases of, well, this person fits this particular community. I'm going to frame them as like if somebody has a mental health condition, and you frame them as like psychotic or unstable or something, that's going to frame how you think about them going forward. You're less likely to give them the benefit of the doubt. You're less likely to understand or even try to understand their situation. And you're less likely going to give them proper care because you've written them off as a derogatory term. And there are plenty of ways that this negatively impacts people. And I think this community, I don't have to explain too much about why that's problematic, but kind of going into the end of the actual PowerPoint itself, how does this impact healthcare outcomes? And we know that there's a lot of impacts based on this. And this is where the medical community is reevaluating a lot of our approach to people. And it comes down to this question of, are poor outcomes a result of inherent biological difference, or are there other variables at play? And we're learning about a lot of different variables that we just didn't think about because we were so engaged with type 1 thinking and our cognitive biases that we just assume that these are biological differences when they really aren't at all. And one of the biggest ways that we've seen this play out is with race versus racism in medicine. And there's some pretty horrifying history about race in medicine. And so often it has been thought that race itself is a biological difference contributing to healthcare outcomes. But if you really think about it, like there's nothing about a person's like made up because I mean race is a at the end of the day is a social thing that we came up with. People as individuals are inherently biologically different from each other. So race is kind of a meaningless word in general. It's a meaningless topic. So we've often thought that race was the reason people had different outcomes. And you do see among different communities, you do see differences in outcomes. But is this from a biological difference, or is this a result of social factors? Are there other things playing into this? And we've come to the realization that racism is really the driving factor for these differences. And even now, we are just now taking away calculations that factor in race for kidney failure statistics. Like your kidney clearance on your kidney, like glomerular filtration used to be estimated based on race, and there's still a lot of hospitals doing that. Like it's something that persists to this day. And we're just now, like our newest generation of docs is saying, hey, this is not okay. Like the reason for a lot of these perceived differences is because of social factors. It's people living in areas that are less desirable because they didn't have a choice. It's from people not having livable income. It's people having some pretty brutal things happening to them in history. Like it's not the biological difference that accounts for those outcomes. Granted, with all of these categories, we need to look at like how do we move forward, and are there different things that we need to do to help people like get the best and most optimal care, but we can't look at it as a race-based thing. We need to take all of the variables into account, them largely being social factors, and see the individual for what their risks are, where we need to go forward. And another great example of this is sex versus socialization. And we see like there's a lot of healthcare disparity in people that were socialized to be women. But we oftentimes, like this kind of goes into gender identity and transphobia as well. Like there are a lot of people that have similar outcomes that are like they identify as male, they are men, or they are non-binary. They're any combination of gender or no combination of gender at all, who have similar outcomes because of socialization and social expectations. And similarly, there's a lot of factors that, you know, make women seem inferior, seem biologically inferior, and it's not because of their biological sex. It is because of the way that they were raised in society. Like if you think about like brain differences, like the brain structure of like males and females are, it's not different. There are no structural differences that are consistent and general and able to be generalized among all people. But the difference is a lot of people like that were socialized as male have access to different types of education earlier. They have access to more kinesthetic learning earlier on, more spatial education earlier on. And people socialized as women don't have that access as early when they're able to learn those things. And so we're seeing a lot of consequences of how people engage with society and how people have like outcomes based on that, as well as like the way we conduct health research based on sex assigned at birth. Like the majority of research is tailored to cis men, but specifically cis white men. And then that information is generalized to everybody. And then we say, oh, well, this woman is an exception. Well, no, they're not an exception. This is a variation of the full spectrum of things that can happen. And so we have women that are getting like worse treatment and worse care because they're not taken as seriously because they just weren't studied. Or some of those other biases were applied of stereotyping of women are hysterical, or you can't have logic if you're pregnant. Like that's legitimately, we had a call on Talk Heathen the last time I was on where a guy had said that testosterone gives men logic and women can't be logical because they need to have the babies. And like that was an actual claim that was made. So these things happen. These things happen. And it's a result of people not understanding anything.
Like, well, like even we do it subconsciously when even interacting with babies, you know, like
Yep.
like if a baby's assigned male at birth, you know, the grasp reflex, people naturally play with like strength, try to feel the strength of the baby's like pull, like play with them, like, you know, in a more like gentle competitive manner versus if a baby girl is doing the reflex, they don't do that so much, so it's even in subtle ways that even people like they just do it out of habit. They're already putting a baby into a gender role, without even really thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then going into gender identity and transphobia, there's no inherent biological difference that makes trans people have mental illness. Like, these are often comorbid, not because they're trans, but because of the things that society does to them. And so that's something that we need to think about. Like, are we assuming that this trans person has an anxiety disorder or has depression or has PTSD because they're trans? Like, it's very possible and a very good thing. And I think more trans kids are able to live lives that are supported, at least in their homes. Granted, they still deal with it a lot in public, even if their homes are supportive. But like, you can be trans and have no mental illness at all. Like, you can just be trans and exist. And that's a totally valid possibility that I'm hoping becomes more common. But unfortunately, when you live in a society that wasn't built for you, it's distressing. And so you can have poor outcomes based on that. And that's the same thing with all of these categories here, and why I also wanted to add disability versus ableism here, because like, is there anatomy or is there physiology or is there normal variation something that is inherently a problem? Or are they being asked to exist in a society that wasn't built for them? And are we just not allowing them to participate and to be at the table? And that's something, like, a great example is the deaf community. Like, if everybody learned to sign, we'd have a lot better integration of the deaf community in the hearing society, because we'd be making an effort to communicate in a similar language. It's not that they by default can't function in our society. That would be a stupid thing to say. Like, a lot of the disconnect is our fault for not letting them be part of this, and not extending like ourselves in certain ways to make them welcome in our society. Similarly with neurodivergence, like, we have assumptions that professionalism is a certain way, which is all. I have so many thoughts about the origin of professionalism in European cultures and how it started with very rich people who wanted to be seen as very rich people, and wanted to prevent other people from getting certain places in society because they wanted things done a very certain way. So a lot of these come from, how can we push other people out and not welcome them in? And now we're having a very hard time letting these things go. So kind of the last point I want to go on with all of this, just really putting things into a picture here, because pictures are amazing. So here's kind of the interplay of healthcare disparity. So you can really start at any point in this circle, and it's just going to keep going wherever. So
Can
like,
you describe it aloud
yeah.
for our viewers
Yes.
who are listening?
Yes. So we have here a picture, and this is a cycle of healthcare disparity. So I'm going to start from low income. Let's say somebody started from a place where they don't make a lot of money. And so since they don't make a lot of money, they can't afford a lot of high quality food or very nutritious food. So they get health problems because they don't have appropriate nutrition. And because they don't have appropriate nutrition, or because they live in an area without access to that, they have more discrimination because they're not beautiful, they're not buff, they're not doing all these things because they can't afford their gym membership. They can't even afford proper food for themselves. So they're now they already were in a lower class of society, but now, like, they're not one of the good ones, in quotes, in the lower class of society. they're even further down on the list because they can't even make, like, they can't even get appropriate food and stuff. So we're going to discriminate against them more. And that, with that comes social exclusion, and likely violence. So you got people now that they no longer fit in society. People don't want to be around them, and can engage in some very violent acts. And even just social exclusion, uh, even stemming from poor education, but contributing now to poor education, because they can no longer be in society. They're not welcomed there. They're not welcomed in a classroom, so they can't learn about healthcare things. They can't learn about ways to be healthier. So they don't. So they don't learn about it. And so they don't. Well, they can't afford healthcare to begin with. We already established that. But now they don't even know when they need to. Like, let's say someone offered them the ability to get healthcare. Like, let's say somebody offered them free COVID vaccines, which that was the thing for a while. Like, you get a COVID vaccine, but they don't understand why they need it because nobody taught them. They don't understand, and so they don't get one. They get sick. They don't have anybody to go to for it. But then eventually they get so sick that finally, you know, something happens. They end up going to the hospital, and now they use a lot of resources because they're at a point now where they needed a lot more help than maybe they needed at first. Like, initially, they just needed a COVID vaccine, but now they're in the ICU on a ventilator, and they can't afford that. As we know from the beginning, they couldn't afford that to begin with. But now they've used that. Now they have chronic healthcare conditions, because they were on this ventilator. Maybe they got a ventilator-acquired pneumonia, or something else happened. They had other exposures. Now they have lifelong consequences of this illness that stemmed from their low income. And now that they have that, now they have more expenses on top of that. So now they have the hospital expenses from their ICU stay, and they have this chronic condition that maybe if they need to be on oxygen permanently, they got to afford oxygen, like, delivered to them. They have to afford the rest of the equipment. They have to afford follow-up care for that. And so they're just having more expenses that either they're going into massive debt for, or they're just, not getting the care. And then they can't work anymore because they have these chronic conditions and they're more limited. So they can't get a job that'll pay them more. So then they're back to square one again. So all of this, it's a giant cycle where you can see at any point of this, doesn't really matter where you start, but at some point it can just lead to all of these other things. And this is why it's so important to address these sources of bias, and address how we're engaging with these problems, because it does matter. All of this absolutely matters. And we can't forget about the humanism and why we're talking about these things, no matter what field they're coming from. Like, this is a medical example, but you talk about psychology and mental health outcomes, it's very similar to this diagram. If you talk about, like, the economy, and again, I know nothing about the economy, but I'm sure it has a similar cycle like this. I'm sure other fields have very similar cycles that follow a model like this. So we need to be doing better. And this talk and the one I had last time, I think, play into this and kind of show why we need to be doing more as a community in general. So that was kind of the end of the slides. Here's some references. But I kind of want the rest of this to be like discussion and Q&A, because I hope this was thought-provoking, and I want to hear people's thoughts of, like, not only what are some things that we can keep discussing about with bias and stuff, but also, like, where do we go from here? How do we address this from whatever field you come from? We have lots of people here from all different backgrounds, all different like, fields of expertise. How do we go forward? And with that, I'll pass it back to our hosts.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ben. That was fantastic, as we knew it would be. And what I really love about your presentation this time and the previous time too is how you make those connections between biology and sociology and psychology, and note how these things do not exist in a vacuum, but one affects the other. And we can't just say, oh, you're having a biological outcome, you're having this or that health condition, therefore how society is treating you doesn't matter. Your experiences walking through the world are unrelated to that. But in fact, with your diagram in the last slide, you just kind of illustrated how those things absolutely do interact. And what we're calling a disability may only be a disability to the extent that we're physically excluding people from participating in public life based on that characteristic. So, man, that was great. Thank you for sharing that. And we do have some questions. And if anybody has another question that you haven't put in the chat yet, feel free to drop them in. We'll get through as many as we can in the next few minutes. But I think one of the most pertinent ones is that was an awesome presentation. Some people are wondering if the slides will be available. Can we have any copies of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give them to the RFR people, and they can feel free to distribute those.
Absolutely. Okay, so that means email us at rfrx@recoveringfromreligion.org if you would like the slides, or if you're in the online community, just message us in Slack.
Yeah, and I'll get them to you guys after. I want to clean up a couple things and just make sure like all the references are like easy to access,
Yeah.
so that y'all can do that. But yes, I will get them to you.
If you need a reminder, let me know.
No problem.
I'm everybody else's reminder. I wish I could be one for myself.
Same. Also, and I do want to correct myself while we're on the topic. Earlier, I said, we want to describe visual images for our viewers who are listening, and that was a great example of using ableist language that does not make any sense. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to correct myself and use different language for our participants who are accessing the audio of this content. We want to describe that. Okay, moving on. It's like one of those times when you say something and as soon as it comes out of your mouth, you're like,
Oh yeah.
wow, that just happened. Anyway, so sorry about that. I'm trying to do better, and please correct me when I say things that sound silly or ableist. Okay, what other questions do we have, Helen? You got one for
All
Dr.
right. Well,
Ben?
let me. Did you watch House, Ben?
I did watch House.
Okay. So otherwise, if this question would make no sense if you didn't. So, which mental process do you think Dr. House uses more?
It's interesting because House, like, people assume that House uses like a standard like diagnostic thought process. House bothers me in so many ways. I think it's funny because I think House relies a lot on type 1. The way that he engages with his problems is very reckless a lot of times. The way he engages with patients is very reckless. I think he uses both, but like I think there are a lot of times where he uses an opposite thought process than like many physicians would. And I think his particular bias, like I mean his character is a very smart person. But he himself has a lot of confirmation bias, and he has a lot of Dunning-Kruger within himself. Like he really refuses to engage with other professionals and seems to think that he is the only person that can solve these problems and treats everybody else like they're stupid. And I think ideally, like what medicine needs to be is like we need to stop thinking of ourselves as the hero. Like I, as an individual, am not a hero. Like this is a team sport. And I got people here like Will and probably other people as well that play different roles in the medical system, and we need all of them. And there's different, like, yeah, there's different like years of educational experience for different degrees, but that's not to discount each person within their job, because like for some specific jobs, like experience matters more than the years of school. And there's certain things that like nurses do not allow me to touch, and I should not ever touch. And I make note of that. If I'm in the room and something is beeping, I do not touch the thing. I will make sure that a nurse comes in and touches the thing because I should not be touching it. And so like everybody is necessary. And I will often like consult people of different disciplines because I'd be absolutely reckless and stupid to think that as a physician I should be handling all of it. And that's something too, like as I talked about in the previous discussion, is that like having accountability for your actions is very, very important. And a lot of mistakes can be avoided simply by the understanding that I take full responsibility for everything that happens for this patient. And in the case of healthcare, oftentimes the physician is at the tip of the spear for like responsibility. Like if someone's going to be sued, oftentimes it is the physician being sued. But that being said, like as the person at the tip of the spear, I don't want to be like, if I have the opportunity to get somebody better care from a person who knows more than me, I'd be stupid to take the fall for something that somebody else could have easily assisted with. Like that would be absolutely dumb. so, um, so I think it's a team sport, and I think House. This is a long-winded answer to say that House would have been better if he engaged with a team sport instead of trying to do it all himself.
That was great. I love how Hollywood just consistently gives really unrealistic descriptions and depictions of professions that then somehow get into people's minds as what is actually happening. So thank you for clearing that
Well,
up.
they have an hour show.
This
So,
is true.
you have an
They have
hour.
to make
Yeah.
it. They have to make it entertaining. It's not like
Yeah.
they're not. Their job is to make an entertaining program, and sometimes real life isn't as entertaining as that.
Like,
So I
like
get
I'm
it.
sure Ben and I have seen like good and bad examples on television of good ADHD and bad ADHD, how it's portrayed, especially in children. So
Sure.
For sure.
Yeah. And so speaking of, you mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect, and we got another question that kind of touches on that. This person is asking, as a patient, how do I tell when someone might not be giving me a reliable diagnosis? For example, a chiropractor might be speaking wrongly but confidently, while an actual expert speaks tentatively.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I am always a fan of being skeptical and getting second opinions and verifying what people have said, because if somebody is an expert, they should be like willing to explain their thought process and be willing to like answer questions of where they got that information, or like what are the guidelines? Where did you learn about this? Like if you ask me, like why I'd be comfortable prescribing puberty blockers once I, get through adolescent fellowship. Like I have guidelines from the AAP, from the AAFP, from all these organizations of like, here's how we like manage gender dysphoria in children. And here's why I'm confident in my answer. Like I'd be happy to offer like all of my resources because you are the one making a decision for your body at the end of the day. Like I can give recommendations, but I cannot make the decision for you. And you should have every right to investigate on your own. And I think if like no matter what, like even if someone's credible or not, like if you have the ability to get a second opinion, like go for it. Like nobody should be afraid of getting a second opinion from somebody who's legitimate. Um, that being said, like with chiros and people who are very confident but bullshitting, like that's where it gets very scary because they know enough to be dangerous and they will say things that sounds accurate, but then you break it down and it no longer makes sense because it does not line up. And it's true that I'm more likely to speak tentatively about certain things because I don't want to be wrong and I don't want to mislead somebody. Um, and so I think probably the best route as a patient is to ask questions, ask as many questions as possible. Do some reading on your own, and like I'm not necessarily in favor of like going to WebMD and just like running with everything that it tells you, but like read what you can and use that to ask questions and use that to say like, hey, I have this concern. Like, can we have a talk about this? Like, and I think that's reasonable. And anybody who's a reasonable practitioner should be willing to answer your questions and say, yeah, this is the concern you have. Here's why I'm reassured against that concern. Or, that's a really good point. Let's look into this. What can we do differently? So I think questions are great. Reading is great. Second opinions are great. And also, like, I say this to a lot of people, but it's okay to fire your doctor. It is always okay. You are not, and it's okay to fire your therapist. It's okay to fire like anybody on your care team that is not aligning with like your goals, with your identity. Like if someone, like I get so many calls on the Transatlantic Call-In Show from people saying like, my doctor is like, I'm worried to come out to my doctor because I don't think that they'll care for me. And like my response is, you should not be seeing this person if you are afraid to come out to them. Like they do not deserve to be caring for you in that case. So, and some people don't have an option, and I empathize with people who don't have that option, but you should never use the authority as a reason to keep them around. You should always fire people that are doing a bad job.
Well, and I think also too that like, we're feeding into like a socialization idea that if someone's in a position of authority, like, they're a therapist or a doctor or, whatever professional that you're going to, that if you're having, some dissonance and feeling like, I don't know if I can open up to this person, it's seen as your fault. Like you're not, this person is an expert. I should be able to discuss anything I want with them because they'll be able to figure it out for me. But, if you're not feeling safe with someone that's giving you any sort of medical or mental health care, you need to reevaluate that. Get a second opinion. And also if the doctor is really good, they will go, you know what? Yeah, you're right. We're not able to form that patient doctor bond. Let me recommend someone to you that might work better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Helen, what's next?
Okay, I think this one's a really good one. Are there sometimes biases towards people who may be obese in medicine?
Yeah, it's beyond sometimes. That is very, very common. And very, very problematic. Like there's a time and a place to talk about it, but it needs to not be laced with bias of like, this is how your body looks, therefore this is your health status. Like that needs to be not the way we look at it. And it needs to be an individualized approach, and you need to factor in other variables as well. So I do think there's a huge problem with how we look at body size, and like our system needs a huge overhaul as far as that goes. And I think a lot of that comes down to just being a better human and understanding that like there are multiple factors, and the outcome is not the same for everybody who looks the same way. Like that shouldn't be something we have to say. Um so
So maybe that's another example of one of the ways where some biological factors are getting mixed up together with some societal factors that could be
yeah,
affecting people simultaneously.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. So
really
that's
good
where
point.
patient-centered decision making comes in, and where you need to really understand the person, like, and you're treating the person. And like I'm not gonna be like the chiropractors and naturopaths that will say like treat the person, not the disease, or not like, no, we want to treat diseases when they are present, but you have to appropriately diagnose and determine what is a disease and what isn't, and then not just say that everything is a disease because it's not your norm.
Great. Okay, so I think we've got time for one more question, and this one is, I saw a video with Dr. Phil, saying something about how we're changing the definition of gender. What do you know about Dr. Phil and his attitude towards the trans community and allies? And do you have any further comments on that for us?
We did have a call on Takis related to this. I really honestly don't give two shits about Dr. Phil. Uh, there's a lot of people that say a lot of things in the media about trans people, and we know that they're jumping on it because it gets them views, and nobody cares about Dr. Phil anymore. And so now he's trying to get back into the public eye by making controversial statements. At least that's my assessment of the situation.
No.
But like, who cares about what he has to say? I don't. But I do dislike the fact that he's saying inaccurate things to other people. And yeah, we are changing the meaning of gender. But it's for the better because, like I mentioned, you shouldn't be able to just lump everybody into one category and just ignore the exceptions, in quotes, because people don't all meet the definition that people are wanting to say. Like Katie Montgomery makes like one of the best analogies. And that is like, if you're going to define anything, like try to find a definition of chair that includes all chairs and excludes all non-chairs. And it's very difficult to do that. Because there's a whole thread on Twitter that had done this, and somebody had said like, it's like a four-legged something that you sit on, and somebody posted a picture of a horse, like, so this is a chair now, or like they post a table and like, this is a chair now. Like, okay, so these definitions are already in flux. And then another example that Arden had used that was really good was the biological versus social definition of a mother. And you can have the social role of a mother and not necessarily have the biological role of a mother. And in our society, it is heavily frowned upon to tell an adoptive mother that she is not a mother because she didn't fulfill the biological role. Like, that would be
Ludicrous.
really out of line to do that. Yet we feel like it's appropriate to tell trans women that they're not women because they don't meet the biological role. Well, like, you're defining this on such narrow criteria, and we can understand that like there are social ways of using a word and biological ways of using a word, but at the end of the day, the biological way of using the word is so like outdated and inaccurate. You're defining chairs for things that are not chairs and excluding chairs when they should be. Like, the biological definitions are just so lazy in trying to include as many people into one category when saying like, but what are the factors at play here? Like, when we say that women have an increased risk of X or Y or Z, like, by what factor? What is why do we think this risk changed? Like, is it because they have XX chromosomes? Is it because they have estrogen dominance? Is it because they have a uterus? Like, you can have people that are women that have some or none of these characteristics. So how can we say that all women have this increased risk of XYZ when they don't even have the anatomy necessary to do those things? Like, how about we just specify our language and say people with this anatomy are more at risk for this thing because of this? Like, that just makes more sense to me. Like, why does your gender play into it? It shouldn't. So Dr. Phil can be angry, and as angry as he wants to be, but he's clearly incorrect and outdated with his usage, and being angry about the way language is changing is just it's nonsense. It's funny. It's honestly a little bit funny to me that people are so hung up on things like that.
Can I just say one thing about Dr. Phil and what a garbage person he is? He has had addicts on his show and will actively encourage them to go down to Skid Row and score drugs so they can appear on his show high. And it's also done the same thing for the production crew or family members if someone has an alcohol addiction to appear on stage drunk. And if they do go to rehab, there's no follow-up care. So just gonna put that out there. What a garbage person Dr. Phil is. Don't watch his show. He's a terrible person. Oh my God, don't.
Yeah, well, and that kind of goes back to, again, just this problem of a lot of the content that we see every day is content that someone has created in order to get views or to generate controversy or get a great soundbite or a meme from. But and that's fine if that's their goal and they're achieving their goal, great. Should we be relying on that as good information? Well, no, because if you're consuming that kind of content, you're getting something that's going to be a very dumbed down, very simplistic description. Like when people want to say, oh, you know, you're getting too academic and complex with all these different definitions about gender and all these identities, and we don't need all that. That's just overcomplicating something that's simple. Well, no, it's not. We're being more descriptive in order to be more accurate. And yes, you can dumb things down. Yes, that is a higher level understanding of a concept. Just like if you get the 4th grade version of learning about planets and that the Earth is not flat, you'll probably hear something like the Earth is round. Well, okay, then you get a little older and you learn more about shapes and geometry and you realize, oh, actually, oh, now I know about spheres. The Earth is a sphere. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, we've gotten a little more accurate now. Oh, okay, great. Then you go to college and you learn about, well, actually, the Earth isn't a perfect sphere. It's an irregularly shaped ellipsoid or something like that. Yes. Is that more complicated and not a great soundbite? Yes. Is it more correct? Yes. Do we want that? Well, probably. It's easy to say round. That's not accurate. And it's the same way when we're talking about some of these complex issues about gender and sex and what's biology and what's a social construct. A lot of these people with these simple sound bites about what is a woman are giving us this 4th grade level understanding of gender and sex, which is inaccurate. When we're coming back with more detailed, more nuanced definitions, we're giving a more accurate definition. It's not unnecessary. It is necessary, my opinion. Okay, off my soapbox too. Dr. Ben, any final thoughts on any of that or anything else you want to leave us with before we wrap up and go to the hangout?
I think I soapboxed a lot, and I think I just spewed my points as I felt them in my brain, as is the ADHD.
ADHD
So,
way.
yes. But yeah, I think that's all I got.
Awesome. Well, it was great and we loved it and we're looking forward to the slides and we can't wait to have you back again. Thank you once again for coming and sharing your expertise with us.